The African sun burned mercilessly as Sarah Miller wiped sweat from her forehead. At 28 years old, she had already faced many challenges working at the conservation center, but never such a severe drought as this one. That morning, 6 animals had arrived, each with its own survival story. The center had been overwhelmed for some time, with full enclosures and exhausted staff. Sarah could barely move her shoulders after 3 consecutive 12-hour shifts without rest. A gentle knock interrupted the work routine. Dr. Martin, the center's director, appeared with a grave expression. He brought urgent news from the anti-poaching team. They had found an 8-week-old lion cub beside its mother's corpse. Its front paw was injured, it was severely dehydrated, and pure desperation reflected in its eyes. The problem was that the center had no space to receive it. Sarah stood before the improvised cage, looking at those round, trembling, amber-colored eyes. In that instant, when their gazes crossed, she made a decision without thinking too much. She offered to take the cub to her house for temporary care. It was a clear violation of regulations, but sometimes compassion must override rules. Dr. Martin reluctantly agreed and gave her 2 weeks deadline, enough time to organize an adequate place at the center. Sarah's old car advanced along the red dirt road toward her small house on the city outskirts. Each pothole made the cage covered with a blanket shake, and from inside came the frightened whimpers of the small animal. It wasn't the first time Sarah brought work home, but it had never been with a creature so dangerous and fragile simultaneously. The quiet dwelling with ivory-colored walls and wide terrace awaited her. There she lived with Richard, her 75-year-old father, a former biology professor who had transmitted love for nature to her since childhood. Afternoon light filtered through windows, illuminating his silver hair as he remained seated in his usual chair. 3 years ago, he had been diagnosed with mild dementia, a disease that advanced slowly but firmly, carrying away his memories, like waves erasing footprints in sand. After her mother's death, Sarah had moved back with him to balance her demanding job with caring for the man who was gradually drifting away from the world. When Sarah entered with the covered cage, Richard looked up from an old book about African birds. For an instant, his clouded eyes sparkled with curiosity. Sarah smiled and placed the cage on the floor, gently explaining it was an injured animal she needed to care for temporarily. Before she could specify what it was, Richard had already seen the small lion trembling beneath its golden fur. A smile bloomed on his wrinkled face, the first Sarah had seen in weeks. "Eh, puppy," he exclaimed with trembling voice. Sarah opened her mouth to correct him, but words got trapped in her throat. How much time had passed since she'd seen her father so happy, with that spark of recognition in his eyes? She chose to nod gently. It would only be 2 weeks, she repeated to herself. Richard knelt beside the cage and, without showing fear or doubt, let his trembling fingers caress the soft fur through the bars. He called him Lovato, a name emerging from some distant memory Sarah had never heard him mention. Perhaps it came from his childhood or some forgotten story. That night, Sarah prepared a warm corner in the laundry room with soft cushions, a heat lamp, and safe space. She carefully cleaned the cub's wound, gave him formula milk with antibiotics, and ensured he rested. Upon returning after showering, she was surprised by the scene she found. Richard had placed a chair beside the corner and read aloud from an old fairy tale book with the firm, deep voice of yesteryear. The small lion, whom they now called Scout, was curled on the cushion, never taking his large amber eyes off Richard's face, as if understanding every word. For the first time in months, the house remained calm. Richard didn't call out to people who were no longer there, nor wander lost during the night. A serene silence reigned that Sarah thought lost forever. The first 2 days passed with anxiety. Scout barely wanted to eat and cowered in a corner with frightened eyes. Sarah feared this fragile creature wouldn't manage to survive. But on the 3rd day, something miraculous occurred. Dawn was barely breaking when Sarah awakened to a gentle murmur. She walked silently toward the laundry room, and upon stopping at the threshold, felt her heart skip a beat. Richard was there awake earlier than usual, something strange in recent months. Sitting on the wooden floor, leaning against the wall, he spoke with Scout in a soft voice Sarah thought lost to the disease. He told him stories of invented adventures, walks through endless forests, fishing trips on tranquil lakes, nights under starry skies. Scout listened attentively, never taking his gaze from him, as if truly understanding every word. Then Richard placed a small piece of chicken before the cub. The lion hesitated barely an instant, before approaching to eat directly from his hand. Sarah held her breath. She herself had attempted feeding him for 2 days without success. There was something in her father's calm and patience that had managed to reach this wild creature. In that instant, a special bond was born between them. From then on, Richard spent every waking moment beside Scout. He read aloud, invented stories, and even sang old lullabies. The cub responded in a way Sarah had never seen. He sought Richard's warmth, curling in his lap for hours, emitting small sounds of satisfaction while the elderly man stroked his golden fur. Gradually, Sarah noticed changes in her father. He rose early each morning, anxious to see the cub. He didn't forget to feed him, though he often overlooked his own meals. He had begun keeping a notebook to record Scout's development, a habit from his teaching days Sarah thought extinct. Most surprisingly, he began telling Scout memories from his youth that the disease seemed to have erased. He recounted his life on a farm, memories of his first dog, even the day he met Sarah's mother, stories he had never told his daughter, but now shared with that silent listener with deep eyes. Meanwhile, Scout thrived. His wound healed. He began gaining weight and showing clear signs of his wild nature. Sharper fangs, claws ready to test their strength, playful jumps that reminded them he wasn't a pet, but a predator in training. Sarah knew the farewell day was approaching. However, for Richard, he remained just a charming puppy. He bought him a small blue collar with his name engraved, and always saved part of dinner for him. He even taught him to sit, and miraculously Scout seemed to understand the command, or perhaps simply wanted to please him. One afternoon, returning from the conservation center, Sarah stopped in the hallway and felt her heart constrict at the scene she found. Richard and Scout slept together on the sofa. The cub had his head beneath the elderly man's chin, and his small body rested on his chest, breathing in the same rhythm. Moonlight entered through the window and bathed the scene with silver radiance. Two beings from different worlds had found comfort in each other's embrace. Sarah observed them silently, moved yet anguished, knowing separating them would be much more difficult than she had imagined. The end of the second week arrived accompanied by a phone call. Dr. Martin informed her they had prepared space at the center for Scout, and he must be returned within 3 days. Sarah hung up, feeling as if invisible hands squeezed her heart. How could she tell her father Scout had to leave? How could she explain that this little friend he loved so much wasn't a dog as he believed, but a lion destined to become a dangerous predator? Worse still, what would happen if Scout's departure erased the spark of consciousness the cub had returned to Richard? With swollen, reddened eyes after a sleepless night, Sarah rose before dawn to prepare the cage. She chose that moment because it was when her father usually slept most deeply. She thought she could carry out her plan without facing his gaze, but upon entering the room, she found something unexpected. Richard was awake, sitting in his usual chair with Scout curled in his lap. There was something different about him, his back more erect than normal, eyes more attentive, unusual lucidity shining in his countenance. In a rare moment of clarity, Richard seemed to divine Sarah's intention. He asked calmly if Scout needed to see a doctor, and his daughter's silent nod was enough to understand. The cub sensed tension in the room and clung tighter to Richard's lap, burying his small claws in his shirt fabric, as if refusing to separate from him. When Sarah approached with the cage, Scout emitted an uneasy whimper, looking back and forth between her and Richard, seeking answers in those faces. The elderly man stroked the cub's back, his trembling hand traveling through the golden fur. Gradually, calm returned to Scout, who allowed himself to be comforted by the familiarity of that contact. Richard inclined his head and pressed his wrinkled cheek against the small lion's, whispering words so soft Sarah couldn't hear, but that seemed directed only to him. Scout responded by licking Richard's chin, a gesture of affection reserved solely for that man. When Sarah opened the cage, the cub retreated, pressing against Richard's chest. It was he who lifted him tenderly, looking deeply into his eyes, as if in that instant they said something without words, an invisible promise. Scout stopped resisting and allowed himself to be placed inside, though his tail wagged with unease. Richard, with feigned serenity, murmured he would prepare cookies to await his return, and strangely, the cub seemed to understand. Scout placed his front paws on the bars without taking his gaze from Richard. When Sarah closed the cage door, the little lion released a low, soft sound, not a predator's growl but a lament charged with sadness that tore Sarah's heart. Their eyes crossed an instant with her father's. In that gaze, she couldn't distinguish whether there was understanding, acceptance, or simply the disease's fog enveloping everything. The path to the conservation center seemed endless. Inside the cage, Scout moved restlessly, stumbling with each movement and making sounds of discontent. At times he stopped, pressing his nose against the bars, sniffing as if seeking Richard's trace in the air. He was no longer that weak, fragile animal Sarah had brought home. Now his fangs were longer, claws firmer, muscles more tense, but in that moment he remained a child separated from the only figure he trusted. At the center, Dr. Martin received him silently. The new isolation area was ready, a space with rocks, trees, and a small pond, a simulation of nature. But none of that could compare to Richard's warm embrace. When they opened the cage, Scout didn't run out like other wild animals. He retreated, refusing to enter the unknown. Dr. Martin tilted the cage until the cub emerged reluctantly. His fur bristled, and his defiant eyes surveyed the place. He released a low growl when the doctor approached, but didn't attack. Instead, he sought the farthest corner with his gaze fixed on Sarah and the exit, as if still trying to find the path back to Richard. "He'll adapt," Dr. Martin said quietly. "This is where he belongs." Sarah wasn't so sure. She had seen how Scout looked at her father, not as an animal at a human, but as a son at his only family. Now he remained alone in a world he had never known. Upon returning home, she found Richard standing by the window, looking toward the road, a gesture that soon became habit. When he heard the door open, his gaze turned to the empty cage. He nodded gently, as if understanding everything. Sarah, with broken voice, explained Scout was at the clinic perhaps for a week. The following days passed in heavy silence. Richard spent hours looking out the window, eyes fixed on the road leading to the house. Sometimes he pulled up a chair and stayed there all afternoon, an old storybook open in his lap, as if waiting for a familiar listener to return. He asked about Scout occasionally with a weak but hope-filled voice. As days passed, those questions became increasingly scarce. The disease seemed to advance faster, as if Scout's presence had briefly stopped time's inevitable flow. Sarah called the conservation center to ask about the cub's health. Dr. Martin explained Scout still refused to eat and spent long hours by the fence with eyes fixed on the entrance door, as if waiting for someone. 2 weeks passed, and Richard's questions about the small lion almost disappeared. Part of Sarah felt relieved. At least her father didn't have to bear the pain of loss. But another part of her was deeply saddened because he had forgotten what had brought him so much joy. One morning, the house's front door was left open. Sarah, alarmed, thought her father had gone out alone again, as had happened before. However, she found him sitting in the porch rocking chair. Beside him was a small plate with bone-shaped cookies, dog treats Sarah didn't remember ever buying. Richard looked up at her with a rare flash of lucidity in his eyes and told her he was waiting for Scout's return. Sarah's heart constricted. Gently, she explained the cub wouldn't return. Richard's pale blue eyes suddenly cleared. He admitted he knew Scout wasn't a dog, though he couldn't remember exactly what he was. He only retained memory of those large amber eyes, the small sound he made when happy, and how he listened to his stories with absolute attention. Father and daughter remained seated in silence, watching the sun slowly rise on the horizon. Richard accepted the truth with unexpected calm. He knew Scout wouldn't return, but still decided to continue leaving cookies just in case he came for a visit someday. Time continued advancing, and the disease kept taking more memories. Richard rarely mentioned Scout, as if the creature had been merely a fleeting dream. However, from time to time, Sarah discovered signs proving his memory remained alive in some corner of his mind. A plate of cookies by the window, a piece of meat saved from dinner, or the old storybook open to the page he used to read to the cub. Meanwhile, at the conservation center, Scout gradually adapted to his new life, though not in the way experts had anticipated. He ate enough to survive, but refused to interact with other lions. He spent hours in corners closest to the entrance, looking into the distance as if waiting for something that never came. Caretakers called this home orientation behavior, a strange phenomenon in reintegrated animals. For Scout, however, home wasn't the prairies or a lion pride, but an elderly man with fairy tales. 6 months later, on Richard's birthday, Sarah took him to the center. Though he no longer recognized many places or people, he still enjoyed observing animals. In front of the lion's area, Sarah saw him. Scout, much larger, rested in the sun on a rock. She recognized him immediately by his amber eyes, the small scar on his paw, and that particular way of tilting his head when paying attention. Richard contemplated him for a long time, tilting his head as if trying to catch an elusive memory. Suddenly, a single word escaped his lips. Scout. Sarah looked at him surprised, but Richard didn't take his eyes off the young lion. A slight smile formed on his face. Perhaps it was only an instant of passing clarity, or maybe in the disease's deepest depths, the bond with Scout remained intact. At that moment, the lion raised his head, his body tensed. He sniffed the air forcefully, and in an instant that seemed eternal, looked directly toward Richard and Sarah. From his throat came a low sound, not of threat, but of greeting. He descended from the rock and approached the fence with firm, calm steps, charged with curiosity and recognition. Richard raised a hand as if wanting to pet him from the distance. "Good boy," he whispered barely audibly. Scout stopped in front of the fence and tilted his head sideways the same way he did when listening to stories. A small gesture, but sufficient for Sarah to understand. He remembered. When they left, the lion remained there observing until they disappeared from sight. Later, a center worker told Sarah it was the first time Scout had approached the fence so closely and the first time he had emitted a sound different from warning growls. On the way home, Richard fell asleep in the car with a serene face as rarely seen. Sarah drove in silence with her heart overflowing with emotions, sadness for what was lost, for her father's memories and the fleeting time with Scout, but also deep comfort. In that instant somehow both had recognized each other. Upon returning, Richard fell back into his usual confusion. However, that same night Sarah found him by the window looking at the starry sky. On the windowsill rested the plate with bone-shaped cookies. He was waiting for an old friend who, at least in dreams, could still return. Sarah embraced him, feeling his body's fragility, and understood this was, in a way, forgetfulness's gift. Not memory loss, but the possibility of preserving faith and hope, even when reality was too harsh. In Richard's world, Scout would always be waiting to return home, and perhaps somehow that was true. In rare flashes of lucidity, in the heart's deepest corners, love continued existing even as memory faded, like the plate of cookies placed by the window each night, an act of faith requiring no explanations, needing no logic, a gesture proving that beyond time and disease, love persisted. And at the conservation center each evening, Scout continued sitting by the fence with his gaze fixed on the entrance door. Two souls separated by distance, but united in memory, an elderly man placing cookies in a window and a young lion waiting. A story that would never continue but would never be lost.